So what did the British think about the Japanese army before the Second World War? This is of particular interest since the British suffered a humiliating defeat by the Japanese army in the Malayan Campaign 1941 to 1942, which led to the fall of Singapore in 1942. To give you a very brief overview of the importance of the Malayan Campaign, here are some crucial numbers. The Japanese forces gathered to attack the British Empire in the Far East were not, by any standards, overwhelmingly strong. The Japanese armada that approached the shores of Siam, modern-day Thailand, and Malaya contained no more than 26,640 men, of whom 17,230 were combat troops. By comparison, Lieutenant General E. Percival, who was appointed General Officer commanding Malaya Command in May 1941, had 88,600 men available in December 1941, including 19,600 British, 15,200 Australians, 37,000 Indians, and some 16,800 locally enlisted Asians. Despite this numerical superiority, the British forces suffered a string of defeats, whereas the Japanese suffered minor losses and captured a lot of equipment and supplies intact. For a cost of 4,500 casualties, the equivalent of a regiment, the Japanese had taken Malaya along with more than 300 guns, 50 carriers, large quantities of supplies of all kinds, some 3,600 vehicles, 800 items of rolling stock, and about 35,000 prisoners. Yet this was just the first part. After the fall of Singapore in February, the total loss of the British Commonwealth forces was staggering 138,000, of which more than 130,000, 94%, were prisoners of war, whereas the Japanese had a total of around 12,255 losses, of which about 5,500 were killed in action. How is this related to the topic of the video? Well, defeated commanders noted that the intelligence about the Imperial Japanese Army was an issue. Now, generally there were a lot of reports and assessments produced by the British about the Imperial Japanese Army. Some were very accurate, some less so, and a few were mostly racist babble. There were three main providers of intelligence to the commanders in Asia, namely the Military Intelligence Department of the War Office, then observers in China, which Ferris calls the old China hands, so basically people that spend a lot of time in China in various roles and thus are rather familiar with the region, or basically you can call them observers in China, and then British observers in Japan, which provided the most accurate assessments. Now, it is very important here to mention that this is an assessment of the Imperial Japanese Army by British Army standards. This is important since armies look at different aspects than navies and air forces. This becomes more apparent if we factor in the so-called national character ascribed to the Japanese at the time. For a combination of genetic and environmental factors, Japanese were regarded as lacking aptitude for machines, an effective sense of balance, and the capacity for innovation, and yet as having high thresholds of pain, great endurance, obedience to hierarchy. Air and naval officers prized the first set of qualities far above the second. Hence, these ideas led them to underrate Japanese pilots and sailors. Army officers respected the qualities in both categories. Hence, these concepts led them both to praise and to bury the Imperial Japanese Army, namely to respect its infantry but to criticize its more technical combat arms, particularly armor. Now, there were several important events that had a major influence on the British view of the Imperial Japanese Army, some of them positively and some of them negatively. Let's begin with the baseline, namely before the First World War and the early interwar years. In 1914, the Imperial Japanese Army was regarded as a formidable and modern army. Since it missed the military revolution forced by the First World War, its reputation declined. In 1923, the British Embassy reported that the Japanese Army today is in essential the same as in pre-war days, as regards morale, discipline, endurance, and military qualities generally. On the other hand, tactics are still out of date. Although the Japanese encountered the strength of defensive machine gun fire in the Russo-Japanese War, it had a less crucial influence than the experience of the Western Front of the First World War. As such, the Japanese failed to improve their tactics considerably in comparison to other forces. As such, this assessment was spot on. Between 1919 to 1932, the tactics of the Imperial Japanese Army were obsolete even by standards of East Asia. Now, what happened in 1932? The first Shanghai Incident, in which the Japanese incited disturbances via agent provocateurs, and following the outbreak of violence, the Imperial Japanese Navy sent in infantry, which was heavily outnumbered by the Chinese, and thus the Japanese called for reinforcements. The Chinese put up a stiff resistance that was not expected by the Japanese. Further Japanese reinforcements were sent in, which underestimated the Chinese and took heavy losses. Ultimately, the Chinese withdrew, yet the reputation of the Imperial Japanese Army was tarnished, except inside of Japan. The emotional sensationalism shielded the army from criticism of its incompetence that had needlessly wasted soldiers' lives. Although the public image was not tarnished, the Japanese learned their lessons from this, and this was also reported by one British observer. Yet generally this view was not shared. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which in traditional historiography starts in 1937, further led to a decline of British views on the Imperial Japanese Army. The bulk of material emanated from the Imperial Japanese Army's operation in the Sino-Japanese conflict that began in July 1937 and gave rise to the conclusion that its fighting spirit was questionable. From the onset of hostilities, British observers emphasized that because the war was unpopular among the Japanese population, conscripts were openly expressing war weariness and a disapproval of government's policies. Nevertheless, there were reassessments that indicated that the Japanese learned and improved their capabilities. For instance, the observers in London. In that year, 1938, the Military Intelligence Department adopted a formula which it retained, albeit with important and implicit changes in meaning, until December 1941. The Japanese army is a formidable fighting machine, but probably has not yet reached the efficiency of major Western armies. It is, however, trained for and will probably only be required to fight in Eastern Asia, where it will have inherent advantages over an opponent. Yet there were others, mostly observers in China, that were very negative about the Japanese army. All other evidence indicates that between 1937 to 1941, the old China hands viewed the Imperial Japanese Army as a third-rate army, whose quality was so low that its operational characteristics were irrelevant. They could never be applied against the Western force. One particular key incident was the Battle of Shanghai in 1937, at which the Japanese faced off against some Chinese forces, including 2 divisions trained and equipped by the Germans. Now, in case you're surprised that the Germans had trained the Chinese, better watch this video, in which I have still hair. But back to the Battle of Shanghai. That the Chinese managed to hold the line and indeed counterattacked successfully on occasion was unexpected, not only to the Western observers in Shanghai, but also to the Japanese. Now, it is important here to note that the Japanese performance in the Second Sino-Japanese War was not bad at all. The problem was that the British had quite a lot of contempt about the Chinese armies. The repetition of the statement that Japan had fought an extremely weak foe in China and had not contrived to win complete victory, together with remarks about Japan not being in various respects the equal of a first-class power, boasted a comforting but erroneous belief that Japan should not constitute too great a menace to British interests. Now, there are some general themes in the assessments that are important to keep in mind. First, in general, the better his knowledge of Japan, the higher an officer's regard for the Imperial Japanese Army. Basically, whenever observation was possible, and sometimes it was very limited, the views changed. For instance, British officers serving in China in 1937 to 1938 had a good and correct understanding of Japanese capabilities with artillery and armor. Ferris notes, experience could wash away stereotype. For the British Army in Malaya, unhappily, experience would not arrive until the Japanese tanks smashed in the main line of resistance on the Slim River. Second, the assessments were often done through a specific lens, which in some cases could be paper assessments, meaning disconnected from reality. British analysts observed the Imperial Japanese Army through the lenses of the preconceptions about war, Japan and its army. They assessed it by reference to 2 standards: against the actual adversaries and environment of East Asia, and against the paper conditions of a first-class foe, with the scales of equipment and force-to-space ratios of Europe. If one looks at the Japanese, the artillery was rather lacking in comparison. Yet in East Asia the logistical situation and infrastructure is quite different. As such, the lack of firepower in artillery is far less pronounced, because it would be far harder to transport and sustain bigger artillery. This is where theory clashes with practice. Reports which emphasized the Imperial Japanese Army's backwardness demonstrated how the available intelligence obscured one of its key strengths, namely the efficiency of its infantry units. Their ability to advance long distances without relying upon transport or fixed communications and overcome enemy defenses with light weaponry proved fatal for Allied forces in Southeast Asia during the opening stages of the war. Now, the British produced a lot of reports, assessments and opinions on the Japanese over the years prior to the war. From those Ferris distilled some general threads that we will take a look now. From a mixture of empirical observation and this bundle of ideas, all British observers produced several important generalizations about Japanese national character. They almost invariably, for example, regarded Japanese officers as stupid by nature and narrow professional nurture. They universally praised the staff work and condemned the lack of initiative of the Imperial Japanese Army. They believed that the Japanese soul was characterized by a mixture of repression, tension, and unpredictability, which would break under pressure and take the Imperial Japanese Army with it. Now, these views might seem rather harsh, yet they were not completely unfounded. For instance, the Doolittle raid, where US B-25 Mitchell bombers were launched from US carriers to bomb the Japanese homeland, sparked major reactions within the Japanese military, although the material damage was very limited. What is more important here is the fact that those observations by the British did ignore in some cases their own weaknesses. The mistake of British observers was not in finding these characteristics among the Japanese, but in finding them there alone. An aura of hysteria also overlaid British reactions to defeat in Asia during 1941-42. Here, as so often, the main error was not underestimating the enemy, but overestimating themselves. While this analysis of Japanese national character possessed some power, Britain was not in a position to exploit any of these flaws during 1939-41. Thus, the emphasis upon them led British analysts and commanders to underrate the enemy. Finally, British observers in China underestimated the Imperial Japanese Army significantly, whereas observers in London saw it as a second-class army in comparison to European armies, basically counting it as equal to the Italian army, but below the Red Army. This rating was low, but not far so by standards of Europe, and it was more accurate than the military intelligence department assessments of many European armies. The MID accurately defined the Imperial Japanese Army's ranking by Asian standards, although it overrated that of Britain in this theater. Observers in Japan provided extraordinarily accurate assessments of the issue. In terms of combat characteristics, all three groups, the observers in London, China and Japan, had reasonable to good grasp on the strengths and weaknesses of the Imperial Japanese Army. They mainly underestimated their ability to conduct retreats and deal with unexpected circumstances. Overall, they had a mostly correct assessment of operational capability of the Japanese Army, except for two significant oversights. None of these groups fully reported on the Imperial Japanese Army assimilation of firepower into its style of warfare. In theory, by 1941 the quality of Japanese material was below the standards of Europe, but it was above Anglo-Saxon standard in Asia. No observer, moreover, ever wanting explicit detail of the power at the point of a Japanese attack, with its mixture of a razor-edge infiltration, a stranglehold of envelopment, a brutal smash of artillery and armor, and ferocious infantry assault. This was due to the fact that the British had limited opportunity to observe the Japanese when they were experimenting with these new techniques. As such, Ferris points out, these observers could see often contradictory trends but not define the future of Japanese tactics because the Imperial Japanese Army itself could not do so. That was the cause of the experimentation. Even between 1941 to 1945, Japanese tactics ranged from superb synthesis of firepower and maneuver to human wave assaults with the aim of suicide. As you can see, although the British intelligence and assessment on the Imperial Japanese Army was not always spot on, it was quite often of good quality. Ferris notes that the Military Intelligence Department's Handbook on the Japanese Army summarized all material and provided information on the Imperial Japanese Army's quality that was accurate. Yet at the same time, the British commander in Asia adopted the least accurate and most disparaging views about the Imperial Japanese Army on offer. So why was this the case? Well, one factor was that the intelligence was likely there, but not really consumed, or if it was not properly digested. The War's Office official assessment of the Imperial Japanese Army faithfully reflected the views of the Military Intelligence Department, but neither raw reports nor finished assessments circulated widely in the British and Indian armies, most of whose officers ignored the topic. Similarly, Fennell in his recent book about the British Army notes that in that region there was a serious lack of spreading the available information. The insights and practices encompassed in doctrine were thus not disseminated evenly throughout the army. In some cases, it is questionable whether these pamphlets were read at all. Apart from the officer cadet training unit at Shanghai, training centers or schools where doctrine could be disseminated clearly were notably marked by their absence. He adds that this was in sharp contrast to the Middle East, where proper training on desert warfare was conducted on new arrivals. Yet Ford notes that the intelligence staff might also be to blame. He notes a report which indicated the Japanese army capabilities in advancing river crossing, envelopment and reconnaissance. This report is usually brought up as an example that the commanders ignored vital intelligence. However, the report was prefaced with a disclaimer that Japanese operations were carried out against an inferior opponent, where the Imperial Japanese Army was able to take risks with her communications which would have proved fatal against a more enterprising enemy. As so often, there's quite some debate going on. Another factor was that some commanders just listened to the wrong guys. This was the case for Hong Kong Command. Here, General Officer Commanding adopted tactics that according to British doctrine should only be used against a third-rate enemy. This in turn implies that he expected the Imperial Japanese Army to act as the old China hands predicted, to launch nothing except massed and clumsy infantry attacks and only in the daylight. After the war, in effect, he admitted as much. Now for Malaya, the situation is according to Ferris quite complicated, since not much survived the war. Yet it seems that the main issue was that the intelligence was not read or ignored. It probably did not help that the intelligence organization was a bit a mess over there. Thus the army received assessments that the Imperial Japanese Army from an organization controlled by the Navy through an intervening headquarters with the most nebulous of function run by a Royal Air Force officer. As an Austrian proverb notes, wie so einfach, wenn's komplizierter geht. Roughly translating, why do it the easy way if it can be done in a complicated way? This is not an excuse, since standard works like the Handbook on the Japanese Army were received. Additionally, in mid-1941, there was a lecture to senior British officers in Singapore by the military attaché in Tokyo. He made clear that the Imperial Japanese Army was a real threat, yet it was not well received. Overall, the perception remained totally off. The assessments of the Imperial Japanese Army accepted within the garrison in Malaya were even less accurate and more disparaging than the former reports of the old China hands during 1937 to 38, and its training for war dismally bad. To conclude, British intelligence had reasonable and mostly accurate information on the Imperial Japanese Army throughout the interwar years and into 1941. There were some gaps, yet considering that in some cases even the assessments of the European armies were less accurate, this is not surprising, especially considering the language and cultural barrier combined with Japanese secrecy. Yet as so often, if one does not listen or is unable to listen, the best information is for nothing. As was clearly demonstrated by the commanders in East Asia, who mostly ignored the information or even didn't bother to read it. Yet I must add here that depending on the situation and perspective, one could argue that the British intelligence failed, since part of intelligence operation is the effective dissemination of intelligence, which obviously did not happen. Well, I hope you learned something new. Thank you here to Justin for helping me to improve the final script and pointing me at various articles. Note any errors are still my own. Special thanks to Jack, Peter and Anna for sending me books that helped making this video. Also a big thank you to all my Patreon supporters. As always, sources are linked in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.